All right, let's dive in. We always hear that in a healthy democracy, the media is supposed to be the watchdog. But what happens when that watchdog, without a single law being changed, slowly turns into a megaphone for the very powers it's meant to be watching? Today, we're going to break down a really fascinating analysis of how consent can be manufactured, not by force, but by a subtle, almost invisible re-engineering of the entire media landscape. And really, this one idea is the key to the whole thing. The argument in the source material is that a free press isn't about reporters being perfect or virtuous. It's almost like a mechanical necessity. Its entire job is to be the grit in the gears of power, to create that friction, to ask the questions nobody wants to answer, and to force a pause where power just wants to steamroll ahead.
So, okay, that brings up the big question, right? If that friction is so essential, what happens to a democracy when it just vanishes? What happens when the whole machine of governance runs a little too smoothly, a little too quietly, with absolutely no resistance?
And here is the central puzzle of this whole analysis. See, on the surface, legally, nothing really changed. The laws that are there to protect the press were still on the books. News channels were still broadcasting 24/7. Newspapers were still hitting the stands every morning. The form of a free press was there, but its function had been completely transformed. And that's the subtle but incredibly powerful shift we're about to unpack. So what does this shift in function actually look like on the ground? Well, you could say the media's entire role did a complete 180. It went from being a tool of interrogation, something designed to question power, to being a tool of amplification, something designed to just broadcast its message. A total flip. The term for this phenomenon is media capture, and it's a really important distinction. See, we're not talking about some dramatic government takeover, soldiers storming a TV station. No, it's way more subtle. It's a quiet convergence where the financial interests of big corporations and the political interests of the government just start to line up perfectly. And in that new environment, it's just plain better business to amplify power than it is to challenge it. So how does this capture actually happen? It's not just about ideology. The source material points to a really powerful economic engine driving the whole thing. The system is fueled by a very simple, very compelling logic. Compliance isn't just the safer option, it's the profitable one. Okay, so let's walk through how this works step by step. It all starts with who owns the media. A lot of outlets aren't standalone businesses anymore. They're tiny parts of massive conglomerates that have their hands in everything: mining, telecom, construction, you name it. Now, all those other businesses are incredibly vulnerable to state regulation. They need licenses, they need approvals. All of a sudden, that hard-hitting investigative piece on your company's news channel becomes a direct, costly business risk to your company's billion-dollar project. And that leads to the final chilling step. Compliance is no longer a moral question. It just becomes the only rational business decision.
This quote from the analysis it nails it. It all boils down to a cold, hard calculation. When the cost of being an antagonist, of being critical, gets too high, then silence becomes a valuable commodity. It becomes the rational choice.
And the other huge economic lever? Government advertising. The source describes a really critical shift here. It used to be a tool of influence. You'd place your ads in the newspapers with the biggest readership to get your message out. But it slowly morphed into a tool of discipline. The whole process became murky, discretionary, with ad money flowing to friendly media outlets, while the critical ones were basically starved of that revenue. But it's not just about the carrots, it's not just about the money. The analysis also points to much more direct levers of control, tools designed not just to reward your friends, but to actively punish and deter anyone who steps out of line. One of the most powerful tools is something the source calls the takeover effect. When a famously independent, critical media house gets bought out by business interests that are friendly to the government, it does more than just silence that one outlet. It sends a massive, chilling signal to every other newsroom in the country. This could be you. This is the price of independence. And the impact is almost immediate. You can literally see the before and after. Adversarial reporting gets replaced with a much softer editorial line. You see respected senior journalists, the ones with real credibility, quietly heading for the door. Those big investigative shows, their budgets get cut, their airtime shrinks, and eventually they just disappear. The entire character of the place changes. This all feeds into another key strategy: selective deterrence. The insight here is brilliant in a terrifying way. You don't have to silence everyone. You just have to make a very public, very painful example out of a few key players. The goal isn't total censorship,
It's to create a climate of fear where everyone else starts censoring themselves. It's an incredibly efficient method of narrative control. And the toolbox they can use for this is vast. We're talking about crippling defamation lawsuits, sudden tax investigations that tie you up for years, regulatory notices, even raids on newsrooms. For a small outlet or an independent journalist, just the legal battle itself becomes the punishment. It drains your time, your money, and eventually, your will to keep fighting.
Okay, so we've got the machine built, we have the economic engine, we have the tools of control. But what does this narrative assembly line actually produce? What does the final product, the news that millions of us see every day, actually look like?
The source identifies this big shift from investigative journalism to what it calls performative news. The focus moves away from reporters on the ground and towards charismatic, loud anchors in the studio. It's not about verifying facts anymore. It's about volume. It's not about evidence. It's about emotion. It's a kind of news that's perfectly designed to generate heat instead of light, to create outrage, not understanding.
And this is so important. The output isn't necessarily fake news. It's about selective visibility. It's about which stories get the spotlight. So certain themes, nationalism, identity conflicts, high drama spectacles, they're put on a constant 24/7 high volume loop. And at the exact same time, really difficult systemic issues like economic distress, the erosion of institutions, or major policy failures, they just vanish from the conversation.
And this quote right here, it gets to the absolute core of the strategy. The ultimate power is controlling the agenda, because if people never see a problem being discussed, they can't contest the so-called solutions, or the lack of them. Consent is manufactured, not by winning the argument, but by making sure the argument never happens in the first place.
So we've reached the end of the assembly line. The product has been shipped. What happens when this product is consumed day in and day out by millions of people? What's the final effect on the audience itself?
This is such a critical insight. The goal isn't to convince you with a rational argument. It's to condition you through sheer, repetitive exposure. When you hear the same narratives, the same outrage over and over and over again, they stop being shocking. They just become the normal, expected background noise of your life.
And the psychological toll of this media environment is just immense. The constant churn of high-emotion, low-information news doesn't create a population of engaged, active citizens. The source argues it does the exact opposite. It produces a deep and widespread public exhaustion. And that leads to this final, pretty stark conclusion. When your trust in the media just completely collapses and the news feels like nothing but noise, people don't lean in, they check out. Active engagement gets replaced by a deep, weary cynicism, which is the polar opposite of what a thriving democracy needs from its people. So let's just run through that assembly line one last time. It all starts with corporate ownership, which creates a structural dependence on power. That's followed by economic incentives that reward compliance. Then you layer on direct intimidation to deter any critics who are still standing. And the final product of all this is a media saturation that creates widespread public fatigue, which completes the entire cycle. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty fundamental question to think about. If the media is how a democracy talks to itself, how it figures out its problems and debates the solutions, what happens when that entire communication system gets rewired to serve power instead? How does a democracy even begin to listen to itself?